When my daughter-in-law mocked my old farmhouse and called it a shack, I felt my heart shatter. That home held my wife's memories, my son's childhood, and every sacrifice I ever made. To her, it was worthless, but to me, it was everything. And that's when I knew. She was about to learn the true price of disrespect. Before I tell you how I turned her insult into the sweetest revenge, make sure you subscribe to Wise Revenge and comment below. Would you forgive someone who mocked your home or make them regret every word? I was never a rich man, not in the way people today measure wealth. I didn't have sports cars parked in my driveway or the latest gadgets filling my house. What I did have was a farmhouse that stood strong through the years, a roof that sheltered me through storms, and walls that held the laughter of the people I loved most. That farmhouse wasn't just wood and nails. It was the place where I first brought my wife after our wedding, the place where we built our dreams together, and the place where I raised my only son. Every corner of that house carried a memory. Every creak of the floor reminded me of nights spent rocking my boy to sleep, and every window still held the view of my wife's gentle smile when she used to stand outside, hanging laundry in the sunlight. Life was never easy. I worked long hours, sometimes taking 2 or 3 jobs, just to make sure the bills were paid and food was on the table. My hands grew rough from labor, my back stiff from bending over fields and lifting heavy loads. But I never complained. Every ounce of sweat that left my body was worth it when I saw my son studying late at night, or when I heard my wife humming a lullaby in the kitchen. They were my world, and I would have gone without a single luxury if it meant giving them a life with dignity. After my wife passed, the farmhouse became even more precious to me. It was as if her spirit still lingered in the walls, in the scent of the flowers she once planted by the porch, in the quiet warmth that filled the rooms even in winter. Sometimes I would sit on the old rocking chair out front and close my eyes, imagining her soft voice calling my name. That house was all I had left of her and of the life we shared. So when people looked at it and only saw chipped paint or creaky stairs, I couldn't blame them. But I wished they could see what I saw. I wished they could understand that a home is not measured in marble floors or designer furniture, but in the love and memories that live inside it. To me, the farmhouse was priceless, and I carried its pride in my heart like a badge of honor. When my son introduced me to Clara, I wanted to welcome her with an open heart. He looked at her the way a young man looks at the center of his world, and I told myself that if she made him happy, then that was enough for me. At first I thought she was just shy, or maybe nervous around me. She smiled politely, spoke in a soft voice, and even complimented the pie I baked the first time she came over for dinner. But as the weeks turned into months, the little cracks in her mask began to show. It was in the way her eyes wandered around my old farmhouse, the way she touched the worn-out furniture like it might stain her fingers, and the way her compliments always carried a faint hint of pity. I noticed it most during meals. I would serve food on the same old plates my wife used to love, the ones with tiny floral patterns that had faded with time. Clara would glance at them, smile tightly, and say something like, "Oh, these are so vintage." My son didn't notice the way her voice lingered on that word, but I did. Or when the pipes groaned and the heater rattled in the winter, she would laugh lightly and say, "This house has so much character." Again, the tone gave her away. She wasn't admiring the home, she was mocking it. The first time she stayed overnight, I caught her in the hallway, whispering on the phone to a friend. She thought I was asleep, but I heard every word. "It's like stepping back in time," she said, chuckling. "I don't know how he grew up here. It's so small, and the smell. It's like old wood and dust." Her laughter echoed down the hallway, and for the first time, I felt a sharp sting in my chest. That house was my life's work, my wife's love, my son's childhood. To hear it dismissed as if it were some broken-down shack cut deeper than any insult could. Still, I held my tongue. I told myself she was young, that she didn't understand what it meant to build something from nothing, to pour your soul into 4 walls. I tried to be patient, to remind myself that my son loved her, and that had to count for something. But deep down, a storm was starting to build, quiet but steady, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it would break. The storm I had been holding back finally struck one evening when they came over for dinner. I had cooked one of my son's favorite meals, the kind his mother used to make when he was a boy. The table was set simply, with the same old plates, the same chipped wooden chairs that had been around for decades. To me, it was home. To Clara, it was something else entirely. She walked into the kitchen, looked around, and instead of offering a kind word, she let out a laugh. "This place really is something," she said, glancing at my son. "It feels more like a shack than a house. I don't know how you lived here for so long." The words cut through me like a knife. My son shifted uncomfortably, pretending not to notice, but I saw the faint smile tugging at the corner of Clara's lips. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't said with kindness. It was mockery. My hands trembled slightly as I carried the pot of food to the table, though I forced myself to stay calm. I didn't answer her. I didn't defend myself. But inside, I felt something shatter. My wife's laughter still echoed in those walls. My son's little footsteps still rang in the wooden floors, and every corner of that house held stories. And yet, in Clara's eyes, it was nothing more than a shack. I sat through dinner quietly, listening to her talk about her friends' new homes in the city, about the marble countertops, the walk-in closets, the luxury cars parked out front. Every sentence was another reminder that she measured life by what could be bought, not by what had been built with love and sacrifice. My son nodded along, his eyes darting to me every now and then, as if he knew I was listening, but too afraid to speak up against her. That night, after they left, I sat alone at the kitchen table. The silence of the farmhouse pressed down on me heavier than ever. I looked around at the worn furniture, the faded wallpaper, the old photographs on the shelves. They weren't just things. They were memories. They were my life. And to hear them ridiculed so carelessly made me feel small, invisible, and disrespected in my own home. I didn't say anything then, but in that silence, something inside me hardened. I knew this wasn't the end of her insults. It was only the beginning. After that night, the air around family dinners was never quite the same. Clara had planted a seed of discontent, and it began to grow quickly. She didn't bother hiding her opinions anymore. Whenever they visited, she would glance around the house with a look of quiet disdain, her words sharpened just enough to sting. "It's cozy here," she'd say, dragging out the word as though it were a curse. Or, "You must spend so much just keeping this old place from falling apart." Each remark landed like a stone in my chest, but I refused to let her see me flinch. The worst part was the way she spoke to my son. At first, she dropped hints about how nice it would be to live closer to the city, where all her friends lived. Then she escalated. She compared him to other men, husbands who bought their wives larger homes, men who drove luxury cars and dressed in expensive suits. "Don't you want to give me the life I deserve?" she'd ask him, her tone half sweet, half accusing. I could see the tension building in his shoulders every time she said it, the shame clouding his eyes as if he were failing her. Sometimes they would argue in hushed voices when they thought I wasn't listening. I'd catch phrases floating through the air. "Why can't you?" Or, "We should already have." Or, "I can't keep living like this." My son never raised his voice back. He just grew quieter, more withdrawn, as though each word drained something from him. I wanted to grab him by the shoulders and remind him of the truth. I wanted to tell him that happiness isn't measured by square footage or granite countertops, that love isn't proven by debt or show. But I held my tongue, because I feared pushing him away. He was already slipping from my grasp, already caught between loyalty to his father and the pressure of his wife's endless demands. Clara's discontent became the shadow in every conversation. Even when she smiled, it was there, lurking beneath her words. And my son, once full of laughter and dreams, now seemed to carry a weight he couldn't put down. I saw it all unraveling before my eyes, the family I had worked so hard to build crumbling under the weight of someone else's pride. And though I stayed silent, I felt the storm inside me swelling, knowing the day would come when silence would no longer be enough. It wasn't long before the storm finally reached my doorstep. One evening, my son came over alone. I noticed the weariness in his eyes before he even sat down. He carried himself like a man burdened by a weight he couldn't shake, and my heart ached because I knew exactly where that weight came from. He didn't touch the tea I poured him, just kept turning the cup in his hands as if he were searching for the right words. At last he sighed and looked at me, his voice low and uncertain. "Dad, I need to ask you something." I nodded, though I already felt the cold grip of dread in my chest. He hesitated, rubbed the back of his neck, and then finally said it. "Clara and we've been talking." She really wants us to move into a bigger house, something newer, something closer to her friends, and I was wondering, maybe you could sell the farmhouse and help us with the down payment." The words stung worse than Clara's insults ever could. My own son, the boy I had raised in this very home, the boy whose laughter had once filled these walls, was now asking me to give it up as though it were nothing more than a piece of property. I looked at him and searched his face for some sign of hesitation, some flicker of guilt. There was a little, yes, but not enough. Not enough to stop him from asking. Inside, I wanted to shout, to remind him of everything this farmhouse meant, not just to me, but to him too. I wanted to ask if he remembered the nights by the fireplace when the power went out, how we played cards by candlelight, or the mornings when his mother made pancakes in the kitchen with sunlight pouring through the curtains. But I stayed quiet. My hands trembled slightly, and I tightened them into fists to hide it. Instead, I forced a calm smile and said softly, "I'll think about it." His shoulders sagged with relief, and for a moment he looked almost like the little boy I used to know. He reached across the table and squeezed my hand, thanking me as though I had already agreed. But after he left, the silence of the farmhouse wrapped around me heavier than ever. I sat there for a long time, staring at the walls that had held my life, wondering how the child I had given everything to could so easily ask me to let it all go. That night, sleep would not come to me. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the familiar cracks in the plaster looking back like scars from years gone by. My son's words echoed over and over in my head, slicing through the silence. Sell the farmhouse. Those 3 words felt like an insult not just to me, but to every sacrifice I had ever made. I closed my eyes and was carried back to the years when this house was alive with noise, when my wife's laughter danced through the rooms, and my boy's little feet ran across the floorboards. I remembered the lean years when we had nothing but each other, times when I worked double shifts, came home with aching bones, and still found strength to tell my son bedtime stories. This house was not just a shelter, it was the vessel of my love, the proof of my sweat, the last remaining piece of my wife's soul. I thought of her as if she were right beside me, her hand resting gently on mine the way it used to when I was troubled. She had always believed in the value of simplicity. She didn't care about wealth or prestige. Her dream was to keep this farmhouse in the family, to pass it down like a gift that carried our story within its walls. She would sit by the window, gazing out at the fields, and tell me that this land was sacred because it was built on our blood, our tears, and our love. And now, my son was asking me to erase it all for marble counters and polished floors. The more I thought, the heavier the ache grew. Every scar on my hands told a story of sacrifice. Every coin I saved went into this place or into my son's future. I gave up vacations, new clothes, even proper rest, all to make sure he never felt the hunger or the struggle I endured as a boy. And now, it seemed he had forgotten. Or maybe he had been blinded by Clara's endless desire for more. It was hard to know who to blame, but as the night stretched on, I realized something important. I couldn't let go of the farmhouse, simply because someone else couldn't see its worth. My life's work was not a bargaining chip. Respect cannot be bought or sold, and I would not trade my wife's memory for the shallow approval of someone who had never lifted a hand to build anything of value. Still, I knew I had to make a decision, and whatever choice I made, it would change everything. The days that followed were heavy, each one pressing down on me with questions I didn't want to face. My son's request lingered like a shadow in the back of my mind. Could I really sell the farmhouse? Could I hand over the keys and watch strangers walk through the rooms where my life unfolded? I found myself pacing the floors at night, running my fingers along the old wooden walls, as though touching them might give me answers. I'd sit on the porch, staring out at the fields, asking myself what respect was worth and whether keeping this house was worth losing my son's trust. For the first time, I entertained the possibility of letting it go. I imagined the "for sale" sign staked in the ground, the papers signed, the rooms emptied. The thought made my chest ache, but I forced myself to picture it. Maybe, I told myself, it would give him the freedom to live the life he thought he wanted. Maybe it would prove my love once more, even if it broke me to do it. But each time I reached that thought, my wife's face appeared in my mind. Her eyes, soft but strong, seemed to tell me I had already given enough, that some sacrifices cross a line no father should ever be asked to cross. Still, I couldn't shake the gnawing sense that Clara wouldn't stop until she got what she wanted. If I refused, would she turn my son against me? Would I lose him completely? The fear of that was worse than the thought of losing the farmhouse itself. I loved him too much to let her wedge drive us apart, and so the storm inside me grew louder, a war between pride and love, between memory and sacrifice. I began quietly exploring my options, speaking with a realtor in town, asking questions I never thought I'd ask. The numbers were staggering. The value of the land had risen more than I imagined. Selling could give me a large sum, more than enough to change lives. The realtor's words echoed in my mind. You could buy something incredible with this. Incredible. That word stuck. Not just something new, but something that could make a statement. Something that would speak louder than all of Clara's insults combined. And in that moment, the idea began to take shape. A plan not born of anger, but of dignity, a way to remind them both what respect truly means. The day I signed the papers to put the farmhouse on the market, my hands shook so badly I could barely hold the pen. The realtor smiled politely, unaware that with every stroke of ink I felt as though I were cutting away a piece of my soul. I kept telling myself it was only a house, only wood and brick and land. But I knew that was a lie. This wasn't just property. This was my history, my wife's legacy, my son's childhood. And now it would be emptied, stripped bare, and passed into the hands of strangers who would never know what it truly meant. Walking through the rooms after the decision was finalized felt like saying goodbye to old friends. I touched the walls of the living room where my boy had taken his first steps. I stood in the kitchen where my wife used to hum while cooking, the smell of bread always lingering in the air. I lingered in our bedroom, remembering the quiet conversations whispered in the dark, the promises we made to each other that no one else would ever hear. I even paused at the creaky stairs, the ones that groaned under our feet, and realized I would miss that sound more than I could have imagined. Every corner told a story, and with each step, I felt the weight of those stories pressing down on me. The realtor encouraged me not to dwell, to focus on the future, but how could I? For a man like me, the past is not something you can simply leave behind. It clings to you, shaping every breath, every decision. Yet beneath the grief there was a quiet determination beginning to stir. I had made my choice, and I knew I could not waste it. This house was gone, yes, but what it had given me, the lessons, the sacrifices, the love, could not be erased. On the day the sale was finalized, I stood outside and watched as the new owners walked in. They didn't look back at me. To them, it was just another transaction, just another roof to live under. I climbed into my old truck with tears burning in my eyes, but my jaw set firm. They could take the farmhouse, but they could not take the meaning it carried. I still held the money, and with it, the power to decide how this story would end. And I already knew I would not use it the way my son and Clara expected. With the farmhouse sold, I found myself holding more money than I had ever seen in my life. It felt strange, almost unreal, like I was carrying the weight of my entire past in the form of paper and numbers on a page. For a while, I didn't know what to do with it. I could have retired comfortably, bought a modest little place, and lived out my days quietly. That would have been the easy choice. But every time I thought about it, I heard Clara's laughter echoing in my head, that cruel little chuckle when she called my home a shack. It wasn't just the insult. It was the way she made my son believe he wasn't enough, the way she tried to erase the very foundation of where he came from. And that's when I realized this money wasn't just for survival. It was my chance to remind them that respect can't be demanded. It must be earned. So I started looking, not for a modest home, not for something practical, but for something that would silence Clara once and for all. I visited house after house until I found it, a mansion that seemed almost unreal. The driveway stretched like a road, lined with perfectly trimmed hedges. The front doors were tall and carved, opening into a hall where the ceiling soared higher than any church I'd ever stepped into. Marble floors gleamed beneath crystal chandeliers, and every room seemed to whisper of wealth and grandeur. It was everything Clara had been begging my son for, and more. The first time I walked through it, I felt out of place, like a farmer wearing his boots inside a palace. But the longer I stayed, the more I realized this was exactly what I needed. Not because I craved it, I didn't, but because of the statement it made. It was proof that I could have chosen this life at any time, that I wasn't poor because I couldn't do better. I chose the farmhouse because love mattered more than luxury, And now, with this mansion, I could show them the difference between wanting more and actually deserving it. When I signed the deed, the realtor shook my hand with a grin, congratulating me as though I had achieved some great dream. But this wasn't about dreams. This was about justice. As I stood in the echoing silence of the grand entrance hall, I felt the strangest mix of emotions: sorrow for what I had lost, pride for what I had built, and a sharp, quiet satisfaction for what was about to come. When the time was right, I called my son and invited him and Clara over for dinner. My voice was calm, casual even, as if I were simply hosting them for a simple meal. I didn't tell them where I lived now, only gave them the address and said I had something important to share. Clara's excitement carried through the phone before she even tried to hide it. I could hear it in her tone, the curiosity, the eagerness. My son sounded hesitant, but he agreed. The evening they arrived, I watched from the front steps as their car pulled into the long driveway. The headlights swept across the manicured hedges and the wide front lawn, and I saw Clara's face light up in disbelief. She nudged my son, whispering frantically, her eyes darting from the marble columns to the towering windows. By the time they stepped out of the car, she was already grinning ear to ear. "I told you," he finally listened, she whispered loud enough for me to hear, her voice dripping with triumph. My son's reaction was different. He looked at me, then at the mansion behind me, confusion shadowing his face. He didn't speak right away. Clara, on the other hand, couldn't stop. "This is perfect. You finally sold that shack and bought something worth living in. Oh, this is what I've been dreaming of. Isn't it beautiful?" She clutched his arm tightly, as though the sight of it proved she had won. I led them inside, letting the grandeur speak for itself. The marble floors gleamed under the chandeliers. The dining hall stretched wider than the entire farmhouse, and every detail seemed to leave Clara breathless. She ran her hands over the banisters, peeked into every room, her laughter bouncing off the walls. "This is it," she declared. "This is where we belong." "Thank you, Dad. You finally made the right choice." I let her talk, let her soak in every inch of the house, until finally we sat down in the dining hall. The silence settled, and I leaned back in my chair. My eyes met my son's. His confusion hadn't faded. He finally asked, "Dad, is this ours?" I shook my head slowly, a small smile tugging at my lips. "No," I said, my voice steady. "This house belongs to me. I sold the farmhouse, yes, but I bought this for myself. Not for you. Not for her." The words landed heavy, and for the first time that night, Clara's smile vanished. For a moment the room was so quiet I could hear the ticking of the ornate clock on the far wall. Clara's smile froze, then cracked into disbelief. She blinked, as if she hadn't heard me correctly, then leaned forward with a sharp laugh. "What do you mean it's yours? You bought all of this for yourself?" Her voice rose with every word, her laughter turning brittle. My son shifted uncomfortably beside her, his eyes fixed on the table, unable to meet mine. "Yes," I said simply. "I built my life in that farmhouse, and when I let it go, I wanted to choose something new for myself. This is my home now." Clara's face twisted with outrage. "How could you be so selfish? After everything we talked about, after you promised to think about helping us, you went and did this. You wasted the chance to give your son and me the life we deserve." Her voice echoed through the hall, bouncing off the walls as if the house itself recoiled from her venom. My son finally spoke, his tone quiet, almost pleading. "Clara, maybe we should calm down." "Calm down?" she snapped, rounding on him. "Your father had the chance to help us, to finally get us out of that miserable place we're in, and instead he decided to play king in his castle. Can't you see? He doesn't care about us. He only cares about himself." Her words didn't sting me the way she hoped they would. Instead, they revealed the truth more clearly than ever. She wasn't angry because I bought the mansion. She was angry because it wasn't hers. I watched my son's face pale with shame. He couldn't defend her, not this time, because deep down he knew what she was after. The silence between us grew heavy, thick with everything unspoken. I leaned forward, my voice calm but firm. "I've given my son everything I had, every ounce of strength, every drop of sweat. I worked so he wouldn't have to suffer as I did. If you think I owe you more than that, you're wrong. This house is not a gift to you. It's a reminder. Respect must be earned, not demanded." Clara's jaw tightened, her eyes flashing with fury. She pushed her chair back so hard it scraped against the marble floor. My son sat frozen, caught between the woman he had married and the father who had raised him, shame written in every line of his face. Clara's fury hung heavy in the room, but I didn't raise my voice to match hers. I had no need. My strength had never come from shouting. It came from the truth, and the truth had been living in my bones for decades. I looked at my son, not at her, and I spoke slowly, each word carrying the weight of a lifetime. Son, do you remember when the winters were so cold the wind rattled these bones of mine? Do you remember how I worked double shifts at the mill, came home with my hands cracked and bleeding, and still carried you on my shoulders because you asked me to? Do you remember your mother, staying up late sewing your clothes so you'd never feel ashamed at school? Every stone in that farmhouse, every scar on these hands, is a piece of the life we built for you. We gave everything, not so you could live in palaces, but so you could grow into a man who understood respect. I turned my gaze toward Clara then, my voice sharpening. And yet, when you walked into my home, all you saw was dust and creaky stairs. You mocked the walls that sheltered your husband as a boy. You laughed at the very ground his mother tended with her hands. When you scorned that farmhouse, you weren't just insulting wood and nails. You were insulting the life I gave, the sacrifices I made, the memory of the woman I loved. Respect is not in marble floors or crystal chandeliers. It is in gratitude, humility, and love. And those things can't be bought. Clara shifted in her chair, her anger faltering for just a second under the weight of my words. My son finally looked up, his eyes glistening. I could see the struggle written across his face, the shame, the guilt, and something else. Recognition. He remembered. He knew I was right. I softened my tone, leaning closer to him. Son, I don't need you to repay me. I never asked for riches, never asked for glory. All I wanted was respect. A simple thank you for the years I carried you on my back, for the nights I stayed awake so you could sleep soundly. Respect is the only currency that matters in a family, and if she cannot give that, then all the wealth in the world will never fill that void. The silence that followed was heavier than any scream. Clara couldn't bear the silence, her face flushed red, her lips trembling with rage she could no longer contain. She shot up from her chair, her heels clicking furiously against the marble floor. "This is ridiculous," she spat, her voice sharp and trembling. "You think you're some wise old man teaching lessons, but all you've done is waste an opportunity. You could have changed our lives, and instead, you're sitting here preaching about respect. Enjoy your palace of loneliness, because that's all you'll have left." Without waiting for a response, she stormed out, her footsteps echoing through the vast hall until the front door slammed shut behind her. The echo of that door lingered long after she was gone, and in its wake the mansion seemed to grow still and heavy. My son remained seated, his shoulders slumped, his eyes fixed on the table as though he couldn't bring himself to look at me. For a long while, neither of us spoke. I let the silence settle because I knew he needed it. He needed to sit in the weight of what had just happened. Finally, he whispered, his voice almost breaking. "Dad, I'm sorry." I studied his face. The boy I had raised now caught in the storm of choices he had made. Shame hung on him like a heavy cloak, and for the first time in years, he looked younger, more vulnerable, like the little boy who once clung to me for comfort. I could have lashed out, could have told him how much he hurt me, how his request to sell the farmhouse cut deeper than he could ever understand. But I didn't. My heart was tired of anger. Instead, I spoke gently. "Son, I don't hate you for asking. I know what it's like to want to give the world to the person you love. But you can't build happiness on someone else's sacrifice, and you can't buy respect with money. If you let her keep convincing you otherwise, you'll spend your life chasing something that will never be enough." His eyes filled with tears, though he quickly blinked them away. He nodded faintly, unable to form words, but the message had reached him. He stayed a little longer in silence before rising from his chair. For the first time, he hugged me tightly, clinging as though he feared I might push him away. I held him, not with anger, but with the quiet strength of a father who still loved his son, even through the cracks of disappointment. After my son left that evening, I wandered through the mansion in silence. The marble floors gleamed beneath the chandelier's light, but I felt no pride in their shine. The echo of my footsteps reminded me that this house, for all its grandeur, was empty. No laughter filled its rooms, no familiar warmth wrapped around me. It was a palace, yes, but it was also a reminder, not just for Clara and my son, but for me as well. I hadn't bought this place out of desire. I bought it to make a point, to show that I had the means to live in luxury if I chose to, but that wasn't the path I valued. As I stood in the vast dining hall, I thought about what had just unfolded. Clara's rage, my son's shame, my own words spoken with a calm I hadn't realized I possessed. Some might call what I did revenge. Maybe it was. But to me, it wasn't about cruelty or payback. It was about teaching a lesson that words alone could never carry. Clara would never have understood if I had simply told her the value of respect. She needed to see it, to feel the sting of envy, to realize that the very thing she craved was within my grasp. Yet she would never have it, because she lacked gratitude. I thought of my wife then, her gentle wisdom, her belief that respect was the root of all love. She would have been saddened by the conflict, but I believe she would have understood. Sometimes life's hardest lessons must be delivered in ways that pierce through pride. My act wasn't born from bitterness, but from dignity. I didn't slam doors or shout accusations. I simply showed them what was possible, then withheld it, not out of spite, but to remind them that entitlement earns nothing. Yet even with that lesson delivered, my heart wasn't light. I missed the warmth of the farmhouse. I missed the sound of my wife's voice in the kitchen, the smell of bread baking, the simple joy of a boy's laughter on creaky stairs. The mansion had made its statement, but it would never replace what I had lost. Still, I reminded myself, revenge doesn't always come with joy. Sometimes it comes with quiet sorrow, mixed with the satisfaction of standing your ground. And that, I realized, was enough. The weeks that followed were quieter than I expected. Clara kept her distance, and for that I was grateful. She didn't call, didn't visit, didn't even send so much as a text message. I imagined her pride was still burning, the humiliation of that evening too raw for her to risk facing me again. Perhaps she told her friends some story to make herself the victim, painting me as a bitter old man unwilling to share. It didn't matter. Let her words float into the air. I had no interest in them anymore. What mattered was the shift I saw in my son. At first, he stayed away too. I think he needed time to process what had happened, to sort through the shame and the anger, to understand where his loyalty had been tested and how easily he had wavered. But then, little by little, he started showing up again. He would knock on the heavy doors of the mansion, his shoulders slumped, his eyes searching mine for permission. I always opened the door with a quiet smile, never asking why he had come, never pressing him for answers. I knew he needed this space, and I gave it to him. Sometimes he came alone. Other times he brought a bottle of wine, or groceries, or even just himself, with nothing to offer but his presence. We would sit together in the massive dining room, the silence stretching between us, and then slowly he would begin to talk. He spoke of his struggles, of the way Clara's expectations weighed on him, of how he felt like a failure for not being able to give her the life she demanded, and I listened, not with judgment, but with the patience only a father can hold. I told him that being a man wasn't about buying happiness with money, but about protecting the things that truly mattered: respect, love, and family. The mansion was still cold, still too large for one man, but in those moments when my son came back to me, I felt a spark of warmth return. It wasn't the same as the farmhouse, no, but it was something. A reminder that even when pride and greed try to tear families apart, love has a way of finding its way back, if only you let it. And though Clara's absence left a silence in her place, I didn't mind. Some silences are blessings in disguise. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself thinking less about the sting of Clara's insults, and more about the lessons hidden within them. The farmhouse was gone, yes, but its spirit lived in me. It lived in every scar on my hands, every story I carried, and every quiet evening when I sat alone and remembered the love that once filled those walls. The mansion around me stood tall and gleaming, but it was never about the marble or the chandeliers. It was about proving a truth that so many people forget. Wealth without respect is empty, and comfort without gratitude is hollow. Sometimes I would walk through the grand halls and imagine what my wife would have said. I think she would have shaken her head at the extravagance of it all, maybe even scolded me for spending so much just to prove a point. But then she would have smiled because she would have understood. She always believed that lessons had to be lived, not just spoken. and Clara had lived hers. She may never admit it, but she saw clearly that day that her hunger for luxury could not bend me, nor could it erase the sacrifices that built the man sitting before her. My son, though still caught between love and duty, began to change. His visits grew longer, his words more thoughtful. He started to ask questions about his mother again, about the way we built our lives from nothing, about the nights when laughter mattered more than money. And each time I told him the same thing. A man is measured not by the house he buys, but by the respect he gives to the ones who carried him. I could see the lesson slowly settling into him, and that gave me hope. As I sit here now, I realize revenge doesn't always look like destruction. Sometimes it looks like standing tall with dignity, reminding others that your worth cannot be mocked or erased. My revenge wasn't about cruelty. It was about justice, about reclaiming the respect that should never have been questioned in the first place. And in the end, that was enough for me. So if you've stayed with me through this story, I'll ask you one thing. Subscribe to Wise Revenge so you never miss another lesson about love, pride, and respect. And tell me in the comments, if someone mocked the very home you built with your hands, would you forgive them? Or would you teach them a lesson they'd never forget?